Hi everyone, and welcome to the very last video lecture that we're going to have for the semester. Yay! We're going to be talking about the Wyoming Judiciary. This is a short lecture and tends to cover just the highlights, the structure, and the nature of the Wyoming Judiciary. Again, there's not a large theme pulling all of this together. It's very important information that you should know, but it's also kind of straightforward. So let's dive right in, get through it as quickly as possible. First of all, there are 4 layers or tiers to the Wyoming judicial branch. Remember, at the federal level, there are 3: district courts, appeals courts, and the Supreme Court. In the Wyoming judiciary, the lowest courts are the municipal courts, next up are the circuit courts, then the district courts, then the Supreme Court. Notice that this is actually reversed, that at federal level, the middle tier we call the circuit courts of appeals, and the low tier we call district courts. Here, district courts are the second highest level of courts in the Wyoming judiciary. But because of this confusion, I'm going to actually, you notice the district courts is in black. You don't need to know this for the quiz. I'm going to try to make it simpler so that you can remember that the municipal courts are at the lowest, circuit courts come next, and then the Supreme Court. So let's talk about municipal courts. You can see the picture of the courthouse here in Laramie. This is where the municipal court for Albany County is located. They do not hear civil cases. If you're getting sued or if you're trying to sue somebody, this does not go to the municipal courts. Municipal courts only hear criminal trials, and in particular, criminal trials that involve breaking city or town ordinances and laws. A state law will not go to municipal court. It will go to one of the higher courts for a trial. The maximum sentence you can get in a municipal court is $750 as a fine or 6 months in jail or some combination. Judges are appointed by the mayor or the city council, and they're considered part-time judges, which means that this is not their full-time job. So that's all we're going to say about municipal courts. Just remember, it's the lowest level of court in the Wyoming judiciary. They only hear criminal trials, and only those trials that involve the breaking of a city or a town ordinance. So if you violate a speeding law or an ordinance here in Laramie, then you'll end up in municipal court. The second tier are the circuit courts, and they also hold criminal trials, but they hold criminal trials involving state laws, yet only misdemeanors. A misdemeanor is a violation in which you can only be sent to jail for less than a year. Any crime where you can be sent to jail for more than a year is a felony. And the circuit courts do not hear felony cases. They only hear misdemeanors. But unlike the municipal courts, the circuit courts also hear civil cases. This is not exactly the same as small claims courts, but it is where small amounts of money are involved. So if you're getting sued or you're suing somebody and there's less than $7,000 involved, it goes to the circuit court. There's also a small claims court that has more of a streamlined process. These involve cases where there's less than $3,000 involved. So again, the circuit courts are the second tier. They hear criminal trials for misdemeanors, and they hear civil cases that involve small amounts of money. That's the main point for this. We have district courts. Again, notice this is not in red. I just put it here for completeness. This is backwards from the federal system. The district courts do have original jurisdiction in which they serve as trial courts for serious criminal or civil cases. In terms of criminal, a felony or even a capital crime just means you can receive the death penalty for it, those go to the district courts. They bypass the municipal and the circuit courts. They also involve civil suits, lawsuits that involve a lot of money, things like a divorce or adoptions. In other words, very serious civil or criminal cases. But the district courts, unlike the previous 2 we talked about, also have appellate jurisdiction, which means that they will rule on municipal and circuit court decisions. Mostly, however, they operate as criminal cases. They typically don't hear appeals cases. Those typically go to the Supreme Court. So let's talk about the Supreme Court. As with the federal level, the Supreme Court has final say over state laws and the Wyoming Constitution. The only appeal above the Supreme Court in Wyoming is the U.S. Supreme Court. So if you believe that a lower court ruling in Wyoming was ruled in error, you can appeal to the state Supreme Court, the Wyoming Supreme Court. Once they rule, though, the only way you can return to the Supreme Court is to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there has to be a federal issue involved. In other words, the ruling by the Wyoming Supreme Court has to somehow involve the federal government in order for you to be able to appeal at the Supreme Court. Otherwise, the U.S. Supreme Court is not going to hear it. There, in other words, is a general appellate jurisdiction over all of the lower courts. That's just another way of saying the Wyoming Supreme Court is the court of last resort for Wyoming. There are 5 justices, and they are elected for 8-year terms. There are a few requirements for being a justice on the Supreme Court. You have to have a law degree. You have to have 9 years of legal experience. People who have both of those are qualified to be Supreme Court justices. Those who are not qualified. Again, just some background, nothing you'll need to know for the quiz. The more important thing we're going to talk about is selecting Supreme Court justices. Remember, at the federal level, it's pretty straightforward. The president nominates somebody and the Senate will vote on that person. They don't have to bring the person's name up to a vote. They can just refuse to hear it. But if they do, then the Senate will vote for it. If the nominee gets a majority in the Senate, then becomes a Supreme Court justice. In Wyoming, however, it's actually a very long, complicated process. It involves a lot of different stages, and it's very different from the federal level. The first step involves a nomination commission. The commission is made up of people from the state bar, people who are appointed by the governor, and the Chief Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court. And this commission selects 3 nominees. Once they've selected 3 nominees, it goes to the appointment stage. Here, the governor selects one of them. The governor can only select one of those 3 nominees chosen by the nomination commission. Again, this is different from the federal level, where the President of the United States can pick anybody he wants. And as long as that person can get a majority of votes in the Senate, that person becomes a Supreme Court justice. Here in Wyoming, there's a nomination commission that chooses the nominees for the governor, and the governor selects one of them. Finally, after 8 years, there's an election. And a majority of the public is required to re-up or retain that justice. There is no opposing candidate, however, which means these justices run unopposed. There's only their name on the ballot, and people only say, should you retain or not retain the Supreme Court justice. If a Supreme Court justice gets a majority of the vote, then they remain as a Supreme Court justice. If they don't get a majority of the vote, if a majority of people say that they choose not to retain that Supreme Court justice, the Supreme Court justice steps down and the whole process starts over. They start again with the nomination commission. Every 8 years after that, there is another retention election. If at any point the Supreme Court justice retires, which eventually all of them will do, then again, the nomination process starts all over at the beginning. It goes back to the nomination commission, then to the governor, then 8 years later, there's a retention election, and every 8 years after that, there's a retention election. So even though there are retention elections every 8 years, most of the time, the judges win big in these elections. Again, there's no opponent, there's no campaign. It's simply voters walk in and ask, do you keep the Supreme Court justice or not? In fact, 95% of justices win their retention election, and the reason is low information. Most voters simply don't follow a judge's ruling. The only time when a Supreme Court justice will lose retention is if that justice has done something scandalous or if the justice has made a very controversial ruling that the majority of people are angry about. And again, when we're talking about the Wyoming Supreme Court, that does not happen very often. So the reality is, once a Supreme Court justice makes it on the Wyoming Supreme Court, that person typically stays there until they either retire or, more morbidly, until they die. So on that happy note, I'll wrap up the lecture on the Wyoming Judiciary. I just wanted to tell you, I hope that you've enjoyed the lectures. I hope that they have not been as dry and boring as maybe you thought they might be when you entered the class. And even after the semester is over, feel free to email me if you have questions or just want to chat about some of the stuff we've talked about in the class. For example, if you want to get an update on my presidential election forecast, feel free to email me sometime around the end of August, and I'll be happy to share that. If you have any questions about this stuff, feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks, and hopefully see you in future classes. Have a good rest of the summer.